The snow was falling soft and steady when Barbara Blatnik stepped out of that car on the 19th of December, 1987, pulling her coat tight against the Ohio winter night. She was 17, full of Christmas plans and teenage dreams, walking toward what should have been a short trip home in Garfield Heights. But Barbie never made it to her front door. By dawn, her family's world had shattered. By the next evening, her frozen body was discovered near Blossom Music Center, and a small community learned that monsters don't always look like strangers. For 33 years, her mother lit candles, called detectives, and refused to let her daughter's name fade into silence. When the truth finally emerged in 2020, it revealed something far more chilling than anyone imagined. The killer had been hiding in plain sight all along, living quietly among the very people who mourned Barbie's loss. Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. Snowflakes caught the yellow glow of streetlights as they drifted down onto the quiet streets of Garfield Heights, Ohio. The 19th of December, 1987, felt like any other Saturday night. Teenagers making plans, parents worrying about curfews, and families preparing for Christmas just days away. Barbara Barbie Blatnik sat in the back seat of her friend's car, her cheeks flushed from laughter and the warmth of the heater. At 17, she carried herself with the confident energy of someone who believed the world held endless possibilities. Her dark hair framed a face that was quick to smile, and tonight had been perfect dinner, jokes, the kind of evening that made winter feel less harsh. "You sure you don't want us to drive you all the way home?" her friend asked, glancing in the rearview mirror as they approached the corner of Warner Road and Grand Division. Barbie shook her head, already reaching for the door handle. "This is close enough. I need the walk anyway." She pulled her winter coat tighter around her shoulders. It was a red coat, bright against the gray December night, the kind of coat that made her feel grown up and ready for whatever came next. The car slowed to a stop, and Barbie stepped out onto the sidewalk. Snow crunched under her boots as she leaned down to the open window. "Thanks for tonight. I'll call you tomorrow, okay?" Her friends waved, their voices carrying over the engine's hum. "Be careful. See you soon." Barbie stepped back and gave a little wave, watching as the car's taillights grew smaller down the street. The night was quiet except for the soft whisper of falling snow and the distant hum of a snowplow working the main roads. She pulled her coat closer, tucked her chin against the cold, and started walking toward home. The streetlights cast long shadows across the empty sidewalk. Each step took her farther from the warmth of friendship and closer to a darkness no one could have imagined. Behind her, the tire tracks in the snow were already beginning to fill. Ahead of her, the night waited with patient, terrible silence. She walked into that silence, her red coat a splash of color against the white and gray world, moving toward a fate that would haunt a family and a community for 33 years. Mrs. Blatnik stood at her kitchen window, watching the snow pile up on the windowsill. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight, each sound sharp in the quiet house. She pressed her palm against the cool glass, peering through the darkness for any sign of her daughter. Barbie was usually good about calling if she was going to be late, usually good about keeping her promises. The house felt too quiet, too empty, like it was holding its breath along with her. Mr. Blatnik appeared in the doorway, his work shirt wrinkled from an evening of trying to nap in his recliner. "She's probably just talking with her friends. You know how kids lose track of time." But Mrs. Blatnik shook her head, her hand still pressed against the window. "Something's wrong. I can feel it." The words came out as a whisper, like speaking them too loudly might make them more true. She moved to the kitchen table and sat down, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The house seemed to echo with Barbie's absence, no music playing from her room, no phone ringing with calls from friends, no sound of her key in the lock. "Maybe I should call around," Mrs. Blatnik said, reaching for the phone. But who would she call at this hour? What would she say? That she was worried because her teenage daughter was an hour late on a Saturday night? The clock ticked on. 1 a.m., 1:30, 2 a.m. She made coffee she didn't want and sat at the table, staring at the clock. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in white silence. Each minute felt like an hour, each hour like a lifetime. Mr. Blatnik tried to reassure her, tried to convince himself, "She'll walk through that door any minute now with some story about where she's been. You'll see." But Mrs. Blatnik knew better. A mother knows when something is wrong with her child, knows it in her bones and her blood and her breaking heart. She sat in that kitchen, surrounded by the familiar comfort of home, and felt the world beginning to crack apart. When dawn finally came, gray and cold through the windows, Barbie's bed was still empty, and Mrs. Blatnik's fear had crystallized into something harder and more terrible: certainty. The call came in at 7:43 a.m. on the 20th of December, 1987. A jogger had been running the trails near Blossom Music Center in Cuyahoga Falls when he spotted something that didn't belong in the winter landscape, something that made him stop running and reach for the nearest phone. Officer Mark Reynolds was the first to arrive at the scene off O'Neill Road. He'd been a cop for 12 years, long enough to recognize when a situation was going to stay with him forever. The snow had stopped falling, leaving the world pristine and quiet except for the sound of his boots crunching through the drifts. She was lying near a cluster of bare trees, her body partially hidden by the snow that had accumulated overnight. Even from a distance, Reynolds could see this wasn't going to be a simple case. The victim was young, female, and completely nude despite the freezing temperatures. As he got closer, his worst fears were confirmed. Barbara Blatnik had been dead for hours, her body frozen by the Ohio winter. Whatever had happened to her had happened quickly, but not quickly enough to spare her from violence. The medical examiner arrived within the hour, followed by detectives and crime scene photographers. They worked methodically, carefully documenting everything while the morning sun cast long shadows across the snow. 17 years old, the medical examiner said quietly, pulling a white sheet over the body. Just 17. Reynolds thought about his own daughter at home, probably just waking up on this Sunday morning. He thought about the phone call that was about to shatter another family's world. He thought about the monster who had done this and then simply walked away, leaving a young woman's life to end in the cold darkness. The sound of the zipper on the body bag seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet woods. It was a sound that would echo in the memories of everyone present, a sound that marked the end of Barbara Blatnik's short life and the beginning of a mystery that would consume a community. As they lifted her body into the coroner's van, Reynolds made a silent promise. This wouldn't be another unsolved case. This wouldn't be a file that gathered dust in some forgotten drawer. Barbie Blatnik deserved justice, and he was going to make sure she got it. But promises, he would learn, are easier to make than to keep. The knock on the door came just after 10 in the morning. Mrs. Blatnik had been pacing the kitchen since dawn, making phone calls to Barbie's friends, each conversation adding to her growing panic. When she saw the police officers through the front window, she knew. She knew before they spoke. She knew before they removed their hats and asked if they could come inside. She knew because a mother's heart recognizes the end of hope even when her mind isn't ready to accept it. Mrs. Blatnik, I'm Detective Reynolds. Could we speak with you and your husband? Mr. Blatnik appeared beside her, his face gray with exhaustion and fear. They led the officers into their modest living room, the same room where Barbie had watched television just 2 nights before, where she had complained about homework and made plans for Christmas break. The words came in pieces, each one landing like a physical blow. Found this morning, Blossom Music Center. We're very sorry. No signs of life. Mrs. Blatnik's wail filled the house, a sound so raw and primal that it seemed to shake the walls. Mr. Blatnik caught her as she collapsed, his own tears falling silently onto her hair. Within hours, the house filled with people. Neighbors brought casseroles no one would eat. Church members sat quietly in the living room, their presence a comfort even in silence. Barbie's sister cried in the arms of relatives who had driven through the snow to be there. That evening, someone organized a vigil at the local park. Word spread through the community like ripples on water, and by 7 o'clock, nearly 100 people had gathered in the cold, holding candles against the darkness. Mrs. Blatnik stood in the center of the crowd, her face illuminated by dozens of flickering flames. The pastor said words about God's plan and eternal rest, but all she could think about was her daughter walking alone into that terrible night. She was just a baby, she whispered to the woman beside her, just a baby with her whole life ahead of her. The crowd sang softly, their voices carrying over the snow-covered park. But even as they sang of peace and comfort, other voices whispered at the edges of the gathering. Who would do such a thing? Was it someone from town? Are our children safe? The vigil was meant to honor Barbie's memory, but it also marked the beginning of something else, a community's loss of innocence and the start of a long, dark period of suspicion and fear. Detective Reynolds returned to the station that night with a notebook full of questions and very few answers. The interviews with Barbie's friends had yielded the basic timeline, the restaurant, the ride, the drop-off at Warner Road and Grand Division, but nothing that pointed toward a suspect. She seemed normal, one friend had said through tears. Happy. She was excited about Christmas, about graduating. She didn't seem worried about anything. Nobody followed us, another had insisted. Nobody was watching her or acting strange. It was just a normal night until it wasn't, until something or someone had transformed a normal Saturday night into a nightmare. Reynolds walked the route from the drop-off point to Barbie's house, timing the distance, looking for anywhere someone might have approached her. The walk should have taken 15 minutes. She'd had less than half a mile to go. The neighborhood canvas yielded nothing. No one had seen her walking. No one had heard screams or sounds of struggle. No one had noticed unfamiliar cars or suspicious activity. It was as if she had simply vanished between the corner and home, swallowed by the darkness. The physical evidence was minimal. The snow had covered any footprints or tire tracks. Barbie's clothes were missing, scattered somewhere, or taken as trophies. The medical examiner promised a full autopsy report within days, but Reynolds already knew it would tell them more about how Barbie had died than who had killed her. He stayed at his desk long after the other detectives had gone home, studying the photos from the crime scene, reading and rereading the witness statements. Somewhere in those pages was a clue, a thread that would lead them to Barbie's killer. There had to be. His coffee grew cold as he worked, the station house settling into the quiet of late evening. Outside, the snow had started falling again, covering the city in fresh white silence. At midnight, he finally closed the file folder and rubbed his tired eyes. Tomorrow would bring new leads, new interviews, new possibilities. It had to. Because right now, all he had were questions, and somewhere out there was a monster who thought he was going to get away with murder. Reynolds gathered his papers and headed for the door, leaving the case file on his desk where he would see it first thing in the morning, where it would remind him that Barbara Blatnik was waiting for justice. The tips started coming in on Monday morning. The phone at the police station rang constantly as people called to report suspicious activity, strange behavior, or just their fears and theories about what had happened to Barbie. A woman called to say she'd seen a man lurking near Blossom Music Center 2 weeks earlier. Another caller reported a car with out-of-state plates parked in the area the night Barbie disappeared. A third claimed her neighbor had been acting strange lately, staying out all night and washing his car obsessively. Detective Reynolds and his partner followed each lead methodically. They interviewed the suspicious neighbor, who turned out to have been working double shifts at a factory 40 miles away. They tracked down the out-of-state car, which belonged to a family visiting relatives for the holidays. The lurking man turned out to be a regular jogger who ran the trails every morning. Each dead end felt like a personal failure to Reynolds. Each cleared suspect meant they were no closer to finding Barbie's killer. The pressure was mounting from the family, the community, and his own conscience. "We'll find him," he promised Mrs. Blatnik during one of his regular updates. "I won't stop until we find him." But privately, Reynolds was beginning to understand what veteran foreign detectives had tried to tell him years earlier. Sometimes the bad guys get away. Sometimes there just isn't enough evidence. Sometimes a case goes cold despite everyone's best efforts. The media attention lasted 2 weeks before other stories pushed Barbie's murder off the front page. The tip line slowed from a flood to a trickle. The investigation continued, but with each passing day, the trail grew colder. By February, Reynolds was spending more time on new cases than on Barbie's file. The forensic evidence had been processed and reprocessed. The witness statements had been analyzed from every angle. The neighborhood canvas had been expanded twice, with no new information. Late one night, alone in his office, Reynolds opened Barbie's file one more time. He stared at her school photo, the one where she was smiling at the camera like she had all the time in the world. The one where she looked like any teenager, full of hopes and dreams and plans for the future. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the photograph. "I'm so sorry." He closed the file and placed it in the stack designated for cold cases. It was the hardest thing he'd done in his 12 years as a police officer. Spring arrived in Garfield Heights with a cruelty that Mrs. Blatnik hadn't expected. The world was coming back to life, flowers blooming, trees budding, children playing in yards, while her daughter remained forever frozen in December. The church services continued, but the crowds had thinned. People offered sympathies and casseroles, but Mrs. Blatnik could see it in their eyes. They wanted to move on. They wanted to believe that tragedy was an aberration, something that happened to other families in other places, not something that could touch them. She understood their need to return to normal. She even envied it. But normal was a country she could no longer visit. Parents in the neighborhood held their children closer now. Curfews were stricter. Teenage girls weren't allowed to walk alone after dark. The community had learned to live with a new kind of fear. The knowledge that someone among them, or someone who could easily enter their world, was capable of murder. Church meetings buzzed with theories. Some blamed outsiders, drifters who had passed through town that December night. Others whispered about local men, casting suspicious glances at neighbors they'd known for years. Trust had become a luxury the community could no longer afford. Mrs. Blatnik found herself studying faces in the grocery store, at church, at the bank. "Was it you?" she wondered silently. "Did you kill my daughter and then go home to your family? Do you sleep peacefully while I lie awake every night?" The detective called less frequently now. The leads had dried up, he explained. The case wasn't closed, but it wasn't active either. It would remain open, waiting for new evidence or a breakthrough that might never come. On a warm afternoon in late May, Mrs. Blatnik visited Barbie's grave at the cemetery. She knelt beside the simple headstone and spoke aloud to her daughter for the first time since the funeral. "I'm not giving up," she said, her voice steady despite the tears. "I will never give up. Whoever did this to you, whatever it takes, however long it takes, I will find him. I promise you that." The words carried across the quiet cemetery like a vow, a mother's determination crystallizing into something harder than grief. It was a promise that would sustain her through the long years ahead, through disappointments and false hopes, and the gradual realization that justice might be a very long time coming. But it would come. Somehow, someday, it would come. By winter's return, the rhythms of ordinary life had reclaimed Garfield Heights. People shopped for Christmas presents, hung lights on their houses, and made plans for New Year's Eve. The terrible events of the previous December had settled into the community's memory like scar tissue, permanent, but no longer acutely painful, for most. For the Blatnik family, however, the holiday season was a daily reminder of loss. Every Christmas song on the radio, every television commercial featuring families gathered around dinner tables, every display of twinkling lights felt like a fresh wound. Mr. Blatnik went through the motions of normalcy because he didn't know what else to do. He went to work, came home, ate dinner in front of the television, but the easy conversations that had once filled their house were gone, replaced by a careful politeness that acknowledged how fragile their new reality had become. Mrs. Blatnik wrote letters. She wrote to the detective asking for updates. She wrote to the mayor requesting more resources for the investigation. She wrote to the local newspaper asking them not to let Barbie's story be forgotten. Most of the letters were answered politely but without substance. The investigation was ongoing. They were doing everything possible. They would be in touch if there were any developments. The other parents in the neighborhood had stopped asking about the case. At first, Mrs. Blatnik had attributed this to sensitivity. They didn't want to cause her more pain by bringing up difficult subjects. But gradually, she realized it was something else. They had moved on. For them, Barbie's murder had become just another cautionary tale, a reminder to be careful, to watch their children, to not take safety for granted. For Mrs. Blatnik, it remained the central fact of her existence. She began leaving the porch light on every night, not because she expected Barbie to come home, but as a symbol of vigilance, of refusal to surrender to darkness. Neighbors noticed the light burning in all weather, through all seasons, year after year. Some found it touching, others found it morbid. But Mrs. Blatnik didn't care what they thought. The light would burn until justice was done, until Barbie's killer was found, until her daughter could finally rest in peace. On the first anniversary of Barbie's death, Mr. Blatnik stood in their front yard and looked up at that porch light. For just a moment, he considered suggesting they turn it off. The electricity bills, the constant reminder of grief, the way neighbors sometimes stared, all of it weighed on him. But then he thought of his daughter walking alone in the darkness, and he went inside without saying a word. The light would burn. 1989 arrived with a January thaw that melted the snow and left the ground muddy and raw. Mrs. Blatnik marked Barbie's birthday with a visit to the cemetery, carrying flowers that seemed too bright against the gray winter landscape. 18 today, she whispered to the headstone. You would have been thinking about graduation, about college, about all the things you wanted to do. The years began to blend together, each one marked by the same painful milestone. Barbie's birthday in January. The anniversary of her death in December. The detective's annual call to let them know the case was still open, still unsolved, still waiting for the break that never came. Mrs. Blatnik developed routines around her grief. Every year, she wrote a letter to the police on Barbie's birthday, asking what progress had been made, what new leads were being followed, what hope remained for resolution. The responses grew briefer over time, more formulaic, but she continued writing them anyway. She kept Barbie's room exactly as it had been, dusting the furniture, changing the sheets, maintaining it as a shrine to interrupted possibilities. Mr. Blatnik worried about the psychological cost of this preservation, but he didn't have the heart to ask his wife to let go. The community's memory was less faithful. New families moved into the neighborhood, people who had never known Barbie, who saw the eternal porch light as simply an old woman's eccentricity. The story faded from casual conversation, relegated to the category of old tragedies that had happened to other people in another time. But every December, when the snow began to fall and the Christmas lights went up, Mrs. Blatnik would stand at her kitchen window and remember her daughter walking into the darkness. Every year, the pain was as sharp as if it had happened yesterday. Detective Reynolds retired in 1995, turning over his active cases to younger officers, but keeping a copy of Barbie's file at home. He would pull it out occasionally, usually late at night, reading through the witness statements and evidence reports, hoping to spot something he'd missed the first 100 times. He never did, but he kept the file anyway, a reminder of the promise he'd made and failed to keep. New detectives inherited the case, each one bringing fresh eyes and renewed hope. But Barbie's file joined hundreds of others in the cold case section, competing for resources and attention with newer investigations that seemed more promising. The trail was 32 years cold by the time someone decided it was worth following again. The police station's basement storage room held the accumulated weight of unsolved mysteries, boxes and boxes of evidence, witness statements, and crime scene photos from cases that had never been closed but had long ago stopped being actively investigated. Detective Sarah Martinez was the newest member of the cold case unit, assigned to review old files and determine which ones might benefit from modern forensic techniques. It was tedious work, often heartbreaking, but occasionally rewarding when new technology could breathe life into old evidence. She pulled Barbie's file on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in October 1994, more than 6 years after the murder. The photos were still vivid, the witness statements still clear, but the trail of investigation had ended abruptly in early 1988 when the last leads had been exhausted. Martinez read through Detective Reynolds' reports with professional interest. He'd been thorough, methodical, and clearly frustrated by the lack of progress. The evidence was minimal, some fibers, a few hair samples, and the certainty that Barbie had been sexually assaulted before her death, but there was nothing that pointed definitively toward a suspect. DNA testing was becoming more sophisticated, more sensitive, but it was also expensive and time-consuming. The department had to prioritize which cases were most likely to benefit from the new technology: cases with better physical evidence, cases with living suspects, cases where a conviction seemed probable. Barbie's case didn't meet those criteria. The physical evidence was too degraded, the suspect pool was too broad, the chances of success were too small to justify the expense. Martinez closed the file and added it to the stack that would return to storage. She felt the same frustration that had driven Reynolds to work late nights and weekends in the months following Barbie's murder. Somewhere out there was a man who had taken a young woman's life and then simply disappeared back into the world, free to live his life while hers had ended in terror and pain. She made a note to review the file again in a few years, when technology might be even more advanced, when resources might be more available. It was the best she could do. The file went back into its box, the box went back onto its shelf, and Barbie Blatnik continued to wait for justice in the basement of the police station, surrounded by hundreds of other victims whose stories had been temporarily set aside but never truly forgotten. Christmas had become the hardest time of year for the Blatnik family, not just because it marked the anniversary of Barbie's death, but because it represented everything that had been stolen from them: the future celebrations they would never share, the grandchildren who would never know their aunt, the simple joy of being a complete family during the holidays. Mrs. Blatnik continued her ritual of setting an extra place at the Christmas table, not because she believed Barbie would somehow appear, but because it felt important to mark her absence, to insist that she remain part of the family even in death. Barbie's sister, now grown and married, brought her own children to these gatherings. They were curious about the empty chair, the extra plate, the photograph on the mantle of a young woman they'd never met but who cast such a long shadow over family gatherings. "That's your Aunt Barbie," their mother would explain. "She went to heaven before you were born, but she loved you very much." The children would nod solemnly and return to their toys, too young to understand the weight of loss that pressed down on the adults around them, too young to know that their grandmother spent every day waiting for a phone call that might never come. Mrs. Blatnik had aged dramatically in the years since Barbie's death. Her hair had gone completely gray, her face lined with worry and sleepless nights, but her determination had only hardened with time. She still wrote her annual letter to the police. She still maintained Barbie's room. She still burned the porch light every night. Mr. Blatnik worried about his wife's obsession with the case. He understood it, shared it, but he could see how it was consuming her, how it had become the organizing principle of her life. Sometimes he wondered if they were honoring Barbie's memory or being destroyed by it. On Christmas Eve 1999, as they sat around their tree exchanging small gifts, Mrs. Blatnik looked at the empty chair and made her annual promise. "We haven't forgotten you, baby," she whispered. "We never will. And someday, somehow, we'll find out who did this to you." Snow fell outside their windows, soft and quiet, covering the world in the same pristine white that had hidden Barbie's footprints 12 years earlier. The porch light burned against the darkness, a beacon of hope in a world that sometimes seemed short on justice. But hope, Mrs. Blatnik had learned, was not something you felt. It was something you chose, again and again, even when the world gave you every reason to surrender. The new millennium brought technological advances that would have seemed like science fiction when Barbie was murdered. DNA testing became more sophisticated, more sensitive, capable of extracting usable profiles from smaller and more degraded samples. Cold case units across the country began reopening files that had been considered hopeless just a few years earlier. But technology was expensive, and police departments had limited budgets. Priorities had to be set, cases had to be triaged, and Barbie's file remained in storage, waiting for someone to decide it was worth another look. The community had changed too. Many of the original witnesses had moved away or died. The landscape around Blossom Music Center had been developed. The quiet woods where Barbie's body was found now bordered by strip malls and housing developments. The crime scene itself had been lost to progress. Mrs. Blatnik watched these changes with a mixture of sadness and frustration. It felt like the physical evidence of her daughter's last moments was being erased, paved over, forgotten by a world that had moved on. She began attending meetings of other families whose loved ones had been murdered, support groups where parents and siblings gathered to share their grief and their determination to find justice. She learned that her experience wasn't unique, that thousands of families across the country were living with the same uncertainty, the same helpless anger, the same desperate hope for resolution. These meetings gave her strength, but they also deepened her understanding of how easily cases could be forgotten. Resources were finite. New crimes demanded attention. Old cases gathered dust unless someone kept pushing, kept demanding answers, kept refusing to let the dead be forgotten. The internet was beginning to change how information was shared. True crime enthusiasts created websites dedicated to unsolved cases, posting photos and details in hopes that someone, somewhere, might have information that could help. Mrs. Blatnik had her neighbor's teenager help her create a webpage for Barbie, complete with photos and a timeline and a plea for anyone with information to come forward. The response was minimal, a few sympathetic messages, some amateur theories that led nowhere, but it felt important to Mrs. Blatnik that Barbie's story was out there, available to anyone who might stumble across it and remember something important. Late at night, she would sit at the computer, reading about other unsolved cases, marveling at the dedication of people who had turned their grief into advocacy. She wasn't alone in her refusal to give up. All across the country, mothers and fathers and siblings were keeping vigil for the dead, refusing to let their stories end in silence. James Renner had built a career out of stories that other people preferred to forget. As an investigative journalist in Ohio, he'd covered everything from political corruption to environmental disasters, but it was the cold cases that captured his imagination. The unsolved murders, the missing persons, the families still waiting for answers decades after their worlds had been shattered. In 2019, he launched the Porchlight Project, a non-profit organization dedicated to helping families navigate the complex world of cold case investigations. The name came from a conversation with a mother whose daughter had been missing for 15 years. She'd kept her porch light burning every night since the disappearance, a beacon calling her child home. The symbolism resonated with Renner. How many families were keeping their own lights burning, maintaining hope in the face of institutional indifference? How many cases were languishing in storage rooms while families suffered in silence? Barbie's sister contacted the Porchlight Project through their website, her message brief but heartbreaking. "My sister was murdered in 1987. The police say they've done everything they can. I don't know where else to turn." Renner called her that same afternoon. He'd learned over the years that families in these situations needed to know someone was listening, someone cared enough to take their pain seriously. Too often, they'd been dismissed by overworked detectives, ignored by prosecutors focused on winnable cases, forgotten by a system that moved on to newer tragedies. "Tell me about Barbie," he said when she answered the phone. For the next hour, he listened as she painted a picture of her sister, the laughter, the dreams, the plans that had been cut short on a December night 32 years earlier. He took notes on the investigation, the dead ends, the years of silence from law enforcement. "We'll help," he promised before hanging up. "I can't guarantee results, but I can guarantee that we won't give up." It was a promise he'd made to dozens of families over the years. Sometimes he could deliver. Sometimes new eyes on old evidence revealed overlooked clues. Sometimes publicity generated new tips that broke cases wide open. But sometimes the promise was all he could offer, the assurance that someone outside the family cared, that the victim's story mattered, that their life and death wouldn't be forgotten. He opened a new file on his computer and began typing, "Barbara Blatnik, age 17, murdered the 19th of December 1987, Garfield Heights, Ohio." It was the beginning of a new chapter in a very old story, the first step toward lighting a porch light that had been dark for far too long. The evidence boxes emerged from storage like artifacts from an archaeological dig. Dust-covered, labeled with faded handwriting, they contained the physical remnants of the investigation that had consumed months of detective work 33 years earlier. Renner arranged to meet with Detective Lisa Chen, the current head of the Cuyahoga Falls Cold Case Unit, at the police station. She was younger than he'd expected, part of a new generation of investigators who'd grown up with DNA technology and understood its potential to revolutionize old cases. "We've been wanting to take another look at this one," Chen admitted as they carried the boxes to a conference room. "The family has been so persistent over the years, and the case has always bothered the detectives who worked it. There was clearly enough evidence to solve it, we just didn't have the technology at the time. They opened the boxes carefully, inventorying the contents. Crime scene photographs, witness statements, evidence bags containing fibers and hair samples. And there, in a small sealed container, were the fingernail scrapings taken during Barbie's autopsy, the potential key to everything. This is what we need, Chen said, holding up the evidence bag. If her attacker's DNA is under her fingernails, we can extract it, and if we can extract it, we can build a profile. And if we can build a profile, she didn't need to finish the sentence. Renner understood. Genetic genealogy had revolutionized cold case investigations, using DNA profiles to build family trees that could lead investigators to suspects who had never been in the system. Chen introduced him to Colleen Fitzpatrick from Identifinders International, a forensic genealogist who had helped solve dozens of cold cases across the country. Fitzpatrick was everything Chen wasn't: older, more experienced, with the kind of quiet confidence that came from years of turning impossible cases into solved mysteries. "I've looked at the case file," Fitzpatrick said. "The evidence is promising. If we can extract a usable DNA profile, I'm confident we can identify the perpetrator within months." The team was assembled. The technology was available. The evidence was waiting. For the first time in 33 years, Barbie's case had everything it needed: scientific capability, institutional support, and people who refused to give up. As they sealed the evidence bags and prepared them for transport to the laboratory, Renner thought about Mrs. Blatnik's porchlight, burning faithfully through all the years of waiting. Soon, very soon, that long vigil might finally be over. The DNA extraction process took place in a sterile laboratory in Virginia, where technicians worked with microscopic samples that held the potential to unlock 33 years of mystery. The fingernail scrapings were carefully processed, the genetic material amplified and analyzed until a clear profile emerged. It was male DNA, definitively not Barbie's, almost certainly from her attacker. The profile was complete enough for genealogical analysis, the crucial first step in building a family tree that could lead to identification. Fitzpatrick uploaded the profile to genealogical databases and began the painstaking work of tracing family connections. The process was part science, part detective work, and part puzzle solving. Starting with distant genetic matches, she worked backward through generations, building trees that branched and converged until patterns emerged. Weeks passed. The family trees grew more complex. The potential suspect pool narrowed. Fitzpatrick worked 18-hour days, following genetic breadcrumbs through databases and public records, cross-referencing birth certificates and death notices, and marriage licenses. Renner checked in daily, updating the family on the progress. Mrs. Blatnik, now in her 70s, listened to each report with the intensity of someone who had been waiting her entire adult life for this moment. "Are you sure?" she asked after each update. "Are you sure this will work?" Renner wished he could guarantee success, but he'd seen too many investigations hit unexpected dead ends. The science was sound, the genealogist was experienced, but there were no guarantees in this work. DNA could be degraded, family trees could be incomplete, suspects could have died before identification. But the signs were encouraging. The DNA profile was strong, the genealogical matches were numerous, the family trees were beginning to converge on a specific geographic area, a specific time period, a specific set of families who had lived in Ohio in the 1982. On a Thursday morning in May 2020, Fitzpatrick called with the news everyone had been waiting for. The family trees had converged. The genetic analysis was complete. She had a name. James E. Zastawnik, she said. Born 1952, lived in the Cleveland area his entire life. The DNA match is definitive. The silence on the phone call stretched for several seconds as the weight of the moment settled over everyone. After 33 years, they had a name. After 33 years, they had their suspect. The hunt was over. Now, the real work would begin. James E. Zastawnik lived in a modest ranch house in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of unremarkable suburban setting where neighbors waved to each other from their driveways and children rode bicycles on tree-lined streets. He was 68 years old, retired, unremarkable in every way that mattered to casual observers. Detective Chen spent 2 weeks building a case file on Zastawnik, documenting his life, his whereabouts in 1987, his criminal history. He had no record of violent crime, no previous arrests for sexual assault, nothing in his background that would have made him a suspect in Barbie's murder. But that was often how these cases worked. The monsters didn't always look like monsters. They were neighbors, co-workers, the quiet man who lived down the street and never caused any trouble. They blended into their communities, hiding their darkness behind facades of normalcy. The warrant was signed on a Tuesday morning. Chen assembled her team, reviewed the arrest protocol, and drove through suburbs that looked exactly like the one where Barbie had grown up. The irony wasn't lost on her. Zastawnik had been living less than 15 miles from where Barbie's body was found. Close enough to drive past the crime scene on his way to work, close enough to read about the investigation in his local newspaper. They approached the house just after dawn, when the neighborhood was quiet and the arrest would attract minimal attention. Chen knocked on the front door while her backup officers positioned themselves around the property. Zastawnik answered the door in his bathrobe, coffee mug in hand, looking like any other retiree, starting his morning routine. He seemed confused by the presence of police officers, concerned but not panicked. "James Zastawnik?" Chen asked. "Yes, that's me. Is something wrong?" "Mr. Zastawnik, you're under arrest for the murder of Barbara Blatnik." The coffee mug slipped from his hands, shattering on the front step. His face went white, then gray, and for a moment Chen thought he might collapse. But he remained standing, his mouth opening and closing without sound, his eyes darting between the officers as if looking for an escape route that didn't exist. The handcuffs clicked into place with a sound that seemed to echo through the quiet neighborhood. Neighbors began appearing at windows and doorways, drawn by the commotion, watching as the man they'd known for years was led to a police car. As they drove away, Chen radioed headquarters with the news that would soon spread across Ohio and beyond. "Suspect in custody. The Blatnik case is solved." The news broke like a thunderclap across Ohio. Local television stations interrupted regular programming with breaking news alerts. Newspapers rushed to publish special editions. Social media exploded with reactions from people who remembered the case, who had grown up in the shadow of Barbie's unsolved murder. Cold case solved after 33 years. DNA breakthrough leads to arrest. Garfield Heights family finally gets answers. The headlines captured the basic facts, but they couldn't convey the emotional weight of the moment for everyone who had been touched by Barbie's story. For Mrs. Blatnik, the news came as a phone call from Detective Chen, delivered gently but without ambiguity. "We have him," Chen said. "The man who killed your daughter is in custody." Mrs. Blatnik sat down heavily in her kitchen chair, the same chair where she'd waited through that first terrible night 33 years earlier. But this time, instead of fear and uncertainty, she felt something she'd almost forgotten. Relief. "What's his name?" she asked. "James Zastawnik. He was living in Cuyahoga Falls, about 15 miles from where Barbie was found." The name meant nothing to her. Not a neighbor, not someone from Barbie's school, not anyone she could remember meeting or seeing or suspecting. Just a stranger who had entered their lives for a few terrible minutes and then disappeared back into anonymity. Reporters began calling within hours, wanting statements, reactions, insights into how it felt to finally have answers after so many years of waiting. Mrs. Blatnik spoke to a few of them, her voice steady, despite the tears that wouldn't stop falling. "I always knew this day would come," she said to a television reporter standing on her front porch. "I never stopped believing that we would find him. Barbie deserved justice, and now she's going to get it." The porch light behind her continued to burn, as it had every night for 33 years. Soon, she knew, she would finally be able to turn it off. But not yet. Not until justice was truly served. The community reacted with a mixture of relief and shock. Parents who had changed their behaviors after Barbie's murder, who had kept their children closer and their doors locked tighter, felt a weight lifting from their shoulders. The monster had been caught. The threat was over. But questions remained. How had he evaded suspicion for so long? What other crimes might he have committed? And most importantly, why had he chosen Barbie on that December night in 1987? The courthouse in Akron buzzed with activity as James Zastawnik made his first appearance before a judge. Media filled the gallery, along with members of Barbie's family and supporters who had followed the case for decades. Zastawnik entered the courtroom in an orange jumpsuit, his hands shackled, looking smaller and more frail than he had during his arrest. His attorney, a public defender who had been assigned to the case just days earlier, whispered instructions as they approached the bench. "Mr. Zastawnik, you are charged with aggravated murder in the first degree in the death of Barbara Blatnik," the judge announced. "How do you plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor." The words hung in the air like a slap. Mrs. Blatnik, sitting in the front row with her surviving daughter, gripped the armrest of her chair until her knuckles went white. After all these years, after the DNA evidence, after the scientific certainty, he was still denying what he had done. The prosecutor, a veteran of high-profile cases, outlined the state's evidence for the judge. The DNA match was unassailable. The timeline put Zastawnik in the area when Barbie was murdered. The case was strong enough to warrant holding him without bail. "Your Honor," the defense attorney argued, "my client has lived in this community for decades without incident. He has no history of violence, no criminal record, and strong ties to the area. He poses no flight risk." But the judge had seen the crime scene photos, had read the medical examiner's report from 1987. This wasn't a case where bail seemed appropriate, regardless of the defendant's recent behavior. "Bail is denied," she announced. Trial will be scheduled within 60 days. As Zastawnik was led from the courtroom, Mrs. Blatnik caught his eye for just a moment. She wanted to see something there. Remorse, recognition, some acknowledgement of what he had stolen from her family. But his expression was blank, almost confused, as if he genuinely didn't understand why he was there. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed the family. Mrs. Blatnik spoke briefly, her voice trembling but determined. "He can plead not guilty all he wants," she said. "The evidence doesn't lie. The science doesn't lie. He killed my daughter, and now he's going to pay for it." But even as she spoke the words, Mrs. Blatnik felt a nagging unease. The legal system was complex, unpredictable. DNA evidence was powerful, but trials could be lost on technicalities, on procedural errors, on the persuasive arguments of skilled attorneys. The arrest was just the beginning. Justice was still a long way off. The audio recording surfaced during the pre-trial discovery process, a piece of evidence that the prosecution had been saving for maximum impact. It was a conversation between Zastawnik and his cellmate, recorded on the jail's monitoring system, capturing words that the defendant probably never intended anyone else to hear. In the hushed courtroom, the prosecutor played the recording for the judge, the jury, and the packed gallery. Zastawnik's voice, tinny through the courthouse speakers, filled the room with admissions and contradictions that undermined his plea of innocence. "I never meant to hurt her," his voice said. "She was just walking there and I don't know what happened. It wasn't supposed to go that way." Mrs. Blatnik closed her eyes as the recording continued, her daughter's hands squeezing hers tightly. After 33 years of wondering what had happened in those final moments, she was finally hearing the truth from the person who had been there. "I picked her up, you know? She was cold, walking in the snow. I offered her a ride." The voice paused, and the courtroom was silent, except for the soft hiss of the recording equipment. "She got in the car. She trusted me." The defense attorney objected repeatedly, arguing that the recording was obtained without proper notification, that his client's privacy rights had been violated, and that jailhouse conversations were inherently unreliable. But the judge overruled each objection. The recording was admissible, and its contents were devastating to the defense. "I didn't plan it," Zastawnik's voice continued. "It just happened. One thing led to another, and then, it was too late to stop." Barbie's sister left the courtroom, unable to listen to the details of her sister's final moments. Other family members followed, but Mrs. Blatnik remained in her seat, forcing herself to hear every word. She had waited 33 years for the truth, and she would not turn away from it now, no matter how painful. The recording revealed not just the circumstances of the crime, but the mindset of the perpetrator. Zastawnik spoke of Barbie as if she had been a willing participant in the early stages, as if offering her a ride had somehow justified what came next. He showed no real understanding of the magnitude of his crime, no genuine remorse for the life he had destroyed. When the recording ended, the courtroom remained silent for several long moments. Then the prosecutor stood and addressed the jury with quiet intensity. "Ladies and gentlemen, you have just heard the defendant, in his own words, confess to the murder of Barbara Blatnik. The DNA evidence tells us who committed this crime. This recording tells us how and why." Outside the courthouse, a cluster of news vans had become a permanent fixture, their satellite dishes pointed skyward like mechanical flowers seeking the sun. Reporters with familiar faces delivered updates to viewers across Ohio and beyond, transforming the steps of the building into a stage for the final act of a drama that had been playing out for more than 3 decades. Mrs. Blatnik found herself at the center of media attention she had never sought but now embraced as a platform for her daughter's story. She spoke carefully but passionately, her words carrying the weight of years spent waiting for this moment. "For 33 years, people have asked me how I kept going," she told a reporter from Cleveland's Channel 5, "how I kept believing that we would find him. The answer is simple. Barbie was my daughter. She mattered. Her life mattered, and her death mattered, and I was not going to let the world forget that." The reporter nodded sympathetically, but Mrs. Blatnik could see the calculation behind her eyes. This was a story about perseverance, about a mother's love, about justice delayed but not denied. It would play well on the evening news, would touch viewers' hearts, would remind them to hug their own children a little tighter. But for Mrs. Blatnik, this wasn't a story. It was her life. It was the defining experience of her existence, the lens through which she had viewed every day for more than half her adult life. "I want people to understand," she continued, looking directly into the camera, "that Barbie wasn't just a victim. She was a person. She was funny and smart and kind. She wanted to be a teacher. She loved Christmas music and chocolate ice cream and terrible romantic comedies. She was going to change the world, in her own small way, and that chance was stolen from her." The cameras captured her tears, her trembling voice, her hands clutched tightly around a photograph of Barbie that had been taken just weeks before her death. It was a powerful image, and Mrs. Blatnik knew it would be broadcast across the state, maybe across the country. She hoped that somewhere, someone would see Barbie's face and remember her not as a murder victim, but as a young woman who had been loved deeply and mourned completely. Someone who had mattered enough to justify 33 years of searching for the truth. The trial would continue, the legal system would run its course, and eventually there would be a verdict. But regardless of what happened in that courtroom, Mrs. Blatnik had already achieved something important. She had made sure her daughter's story was told, her memory preserved, her life acknowledged as valuable and significant. Justice was important, but remembrance was everything. The neighbors on Zastawnik Street struggled to reconcile the man they had known with the monster described in the courtroom. For years, he had been simply Jim from down the block, quiet, unremarkable, the kind of neighbor who kept his lawn trimmed and his opinions to himself. Margaret Sullivan had lived 3 houses down from Zastawnik for 15 years. She had waved to him countless times, had borrowed his snow shovel during the blizzard of 2008, had signed for packages when he wasn't home. The revelation of his arrest had shattered her sense of safety and judgment in ways she was still trying to process. "I feel sick," she told her husband, as they watched the news coverage of the trial. "I invited that man into our house. I let him use our phone when his power was out during the storm. How could I not have known?" It was a question echoing through the entire community. Parents questioned their instincts, their ability to protect their children from dangers they couldn't recognize. Neighbors wondered what other secrets might be hiding behind the facades of suburban normalcy. The coffee shop on Main Street buzzed with conversations about the case, with speculation about signs they might have missed, with theories about what had driven Zastawnik to commit such a terrible crime. Some people claimed they had always sensed something off about him, though none had ever voiced such concerns before his arrest. Others defended their failure to see the truth. How could they have known? He had seemed so ordinary, so harmless. He had volunteered at the local food bank, had shoveled snow from elderly neighbors' driveways, had never shown any signs of violence or aggression. The truth, uncomfortable as it was, seemed to be that evil could hide in plain sight for decades, that the most dangerous predators were often the ones who blended seamlessly into their communities, who understood how to appear trustworthy while harboring the darkest intentions. Late at night, Margaret Sullivan would lie in bed and think about all the times she had seen Zastawnik over the years. All the mundane interactions, the casual conversations, the moments when she had been alone with him and completely unaware of the danger he represented. She thought about Barbie, too, a young woman she had never met but whose story had become inextricably linked with her own sense of security and trust. How many other people were walking the streets, living quiet lives, hiding terrible secrets? The porch light outside her bedroom window burned brighter now, installed after Zastawnik's arrest. Like Mrs. Blatnik all those years ago, she had learned that some kinds of darkness required constant vigilance to keep at bay. The trial stretched through the summer months, each day bringing new evidence, new testimony, and new glimpses into the events of the 19th of December 1987. The prosecution built their case methodically, layer by layer, until the weight of evidence seemed overwhelming. But as the weeks passed, a troubling pattern emerged. Zastawnik's health was declining rapidly. The stress of the trial, combined with underlying medical conditions that had gone undiagnosed for years, was taking a visible toll on the 70-year-old defendant. He appeared increasingly frail in court, sometimes slumping in his chair, occasionally needing medical attention from the court officers. His attorney requested multiple delays, citing his client's inability to participate effectively in his own defense. Mrs. Blatnik watched these developments with growing frustration and fear. She had waited 33 years for this trial, 33 years for the chance to see justice served. The possibility that Zastawnik might escape accountability due to his failing health felt like a cruel twist of fate. "He's faking it," she whispered to her daughter during one particularly dramatic episode when Zastawnik had to be helped from the courtroom. "He's trying to avoid responsibility," but the medical reports were clear. Zastawnik was genuinely ill, his condition deteriorating rapidly under the stress of the proceedings. The judge faced an impossible choice: continue the trial and risk the defendant's death before a verdict could be reached, or declare a mistrial and potentially allow him to escape justice entirely. On a humid Tuesday morning in August, the decision was made for everyone. Zastawnik collapsed in his cell during the night, and despite the efforts of medical personnel, he could not be revived. The man who had evaded justice for 33 years had finally escaped it permanently. The news reached Mrs. Blatnik through a phone call from the prosecutor's office. She set down the receiver and sat in her kitchen, staring at the same clock that had marked the hours of her first terrible night of waiting. "He's dead," she told her husband when he came into the room. "He died in his cell last night." They sat together in silence, processing this final, unexpected twist in a case that had already taken so many unexpected turns. There would be no verdict now, no formal declaration of guilt, No moment of legal vindication that Mrs. Blatnik had been envisioning for decades. But there was something else, something that might be just as important. The truth had been revealed, the family's long questions had been answered, and the community finally knew who had stolen Barbie's life. The cemetery was quiet on the morning. Mrs. Blatnik and her family gathered at Barbie's grave to process the news of Zastawnik's death. The August heat was already building, promising another scorching day, but the shade of the old oak trees provided some relief from the intensity of both the weather and their emotions. Mrs. Blatnik knelt beside the headstone, her hand resting on the warm granite as she tried to find words for feelings that seemed too complex for language. Relief that the truth had finally emerged, frustration that justice would never be formally served, grief for all the years that had been lost to uncertainty and pain. "I'm sorry it took so long, baby," she whispered. "I'm sorry we couldn't get him into a courtroom where everyone could see what he did to you. But we found him. We know who he was, and we know what he did, and that has to be enough." Her daughter placed fresh flowers at the base of the headstone, white roses, Barbie's favorite, the same flowers that had adorned her casket 33 years earlier. The symbolism wasn't lost on any of them. This felt like a second funeral, a final farewell to the active phase of their long quest for answers. "She would have been 50 years old this year," Barbie's sister said softly. "Can you imagine? 50 years old, probably with children of her own, maybe grandchildren. A whole life that got stolen from her." They stayed at the grave for over an hour, sharing memories of Barbie, talking about the investigation, trying to make sense of how their lives had been shaped by one terrible night so many years ago. The conversation meandered like grief itself, sometimes focused, sometimes scattered, always returning to the central truth that nothing could bring Barbie back. But something had shifted. The uncertainty that had haunted them for decades was gone. The questions that had kept Mrs. Blatnik awake at night had been answered. The monster had been identified, even if he had escaped earthly justice. As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Blatnik stood and looked back at the headstone one more time. "We did it," she said quietly. "We found him. We kept our promise." The words carried across the quiet cemetery, a final report to a daughter who could no longer hear them, but whose memory had sustained her family through the longest and darkest chapter of their lives. The active search was over. The long healing could finally begin. The memorial tree was planted on a crisp October afternoon, just as the leaves on the surrounding trees were beginning to turn gold and crimson. The location was carefully chosen, a small hill overlooking the area where Barbie's body had been found 33 years earlier, close enough to honor her memory but positioned to look forward rather than back. Renner and the Porchlight Project had organized the ceremony, working with the park authorities to create something permanent and meaningful. The tree was a young oak, chosen for its longevity and strength, with a simple bronze plaque at its base, in memory of Barbara Blatnik and all those whose stories deserve to be told. Mrs. Blatnik, now 75 and moving slowly but with determination, was the first to place soil around the tree's roots. Her hands shook slightly as she worked, but her voice was steady as she spoke to the small crowd that had gathered. "This tree will grow and flourish long after we're all gone," she said. "It will stand here as a reminder that Barbie's life mattered, that her death wasn't forgotten, and that families should never stop fighting for the truth." The ceremony was small family members, investigators who had worked the case, representatives from the Porchlight Project, and a few community members who had followed Barbie's story over the years. But its impact felt much larger, as if the simple act of planting this tree was healing something that had been broken in the community for decades. As the sun began to set, someone produced a string of small white lights, the kind used for Christmas decorations. Working together, they wound the lights around the young tree's branches, creating a gentle glow against the gathering darkness. The symbolism was perfect and unplanned, a light shining in the darkness, a beacon of hope for other families still waiting for answers, a promise that some stories don't end in silence and shadows. Mrs. Blatnik stood back and looked at the illuminated tree, thinking about the porch light she had burned for 33 years. Tomorrow she would finally turn that light off. Her long vigil was over, her promise to her daughter fulfilled. But this new light would continue to shine, carrying Barbie's memory forward and offering hope to others who were still walking the difficult path between loss and justice, between despair and truth. The community had been broken by violence and healed by perseverance. The family had been shattered by grief and made whole by answers. And somewhere in the growing darkness, a young woman's story had finally found its proper ending, not in the silence of an unsolved case, but in the enduring light of love and remembrance. As the small group dispersed, heading home to lives that had been forever changed by Barbie's story, the tree continued to glow against the darkness, a symbol of justice delayed but not denied, of truth that refuses to stay buried, and of the fierce love that keeps hope alive even in the longest and darkest nights.